Good afternoon, everyone, and we apologise for the technological difficulties that we've just had. We'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land. We would like to pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Hello and welcome everyone to the Youth Suicide Prevention and Mental Health Forum event. I'm Tegan Avery and I'm proud to be your MC for today's virtual event. I am currently an active member of the Mental Health Foundation's Youth Ambassador Program and have been lucky enough to undertake my placement here for my final year of my university studies. Along with my studies in this field, I am passionate about mental health and suicide prevention in general. Devastatingly, I experienced firsthand losing someone I love very much to suicide, and I know too well how real mental health is. Therefore, I am extremely honoured to be a part of today's important event. Thank you to all who have joined us so far. We are thankful that you are here. Today's event aims to facilitate a discussion and raise awareness of suicide prevention and youth mental health. Firstly, just a brief disclaimer. In today's forum, we will be discussing issues that are quite confronting in nature. Please feel free to take a break or a breather at any point that you need to. If you feel affected by any of the content of today's forum, please know that there is always help available. You can call the Mental Health Foundation's National Health Helpline Service on 1300 MHF AUS or on 1300 643 287. Otherwise, you can call Lifeline on 13 11 14. The National Mental Health Month is an initiative of the Mental Health Foundation Australia to advocate for and raise awareness of mental health in Australia. It is an important time where the Australian community comes together to raise awareness that mental health matters. Throughout this month, many events have been organised in each state of Australia, aiming to attract and unite Australians of all ages and backgrounds to raise awareness of mental health for all. Let's now play a video on the journey of the National Mental Health Month.
A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Mental Health Foundation Australia's journey began 90 years ago. It dawned in 1930 with just a founder and vision, which was to reach and impact Victoria. Now we have a presence in all states and changing lives for over 100,000 people throughout Australia. Our organisation's biggest initiative yet is our National Mental Health Month. Our month-long initiative is to advocate and raise awareness on Australian mental health. Our vision is to recharge and educate as many Australians as possible to help reduce stigma and facilitate positive and non-judgmental discussions surrounding the important topic of mental health in Australia. With the theme being Mental Health Matters, the awareness is cumulative. In 30 events we have organised to reach the community in all mental health subject matters affecting our lives today. To further continue our journey of 1,000 miles, the Walk for Mental Health has transitioned from a Victoria-only walk to being a nationwide community walk, where anybody from anywhere in Australia can connect with us and walk with us virtually to spread the impact and awareness of mental health. We pride ourselves with making sure all our programs are for the community and are powered by the community. We have a vast growing network of multicultural ambassadors who are part of our program to further the community voice in promoting positive mental health and wellbeing. Our multicultural network has inspired our educational and multicultural webinars as an initiative to help our fidelity to cope with success during the pandemic, to promote the understanding of unique cultural and ethnic heritage in Australia and the development of culturally responsible and responsive curricula. The Mental Health Foundation of Australia conducted the multicultural research to continue on the development of the fast-growing multicultural fidelity in Australia. With the effects of COVID-19 pandemic, the MHFA has successfully committed the Power Hour of services and the reach to the community, with the helpline hours extended. We are here to show Australians we can be a shoulder to lean on and can be dialed to assist in all mental health matters. Our impact flows into the COVID-19 meal delivery response with the help of the community, local business and our multicultural ambassadors. It has promoted one vision, which is to serve others before self during this time of uncertainty. With over 45,000 meals delivered, we continue to work with the Department of Health, the Human Services, the Salvation Army and the Australian Multicultural Foundation to continue this success. as we continue to work to deepen understanding the importance of mental well-being and educating the community. Let's work together to bring better mental health for all.
I would now like to introduce Martin Kiravosha, who is the current Youth Ambassadors Program Chairperson, to welcome all speakers for today's event. Martin will speak briefly on his time at the Foundation and the Mental Health Foundation's youth programs. Martin is a lawyer currently working in civil litigation and insurance law. Having also worked in a number of industries, including volunteering at family education and support non-for-profit, Martin has experience communicating and interacting with people from all walks of life. During his time, he has developed a keen interest in the Mental Health Foundation and its initiatives. In his free time, Martin enjoys various hobbies, including computer programming, gaming, and sport. I would now like to welcome Martin.
Great, thank you, Tegan. Hello, everyone. Good to see so many people here today. As Tegan said, my name is Martin Kiravosha. I'm the chair of the Youth Ambassador Program for the Mental Health Foundation of Australia. I'm really proud and honoured to be part of this great foundation, all the work that we're doing, along with all my fellow youth ambassadors. Now, on behalf of all the ambassadors and the youth committee, I'd like to thank all the presenters and speakers taking part in this forum. As always, your effort and time is really appreciated. Now, the Youth Ambassador Program is open to all members of the community between the ages of 16 and 25. It's about identifying the key issues that Australian youth are really dealing with, spreading awareness of those issues, and leading initiatives to assist the Australian youth with those mental health challenges. Youth suicide is a key focus of the Youth Ambassador Program and really forms a key part of many of our initiatives. This is the reason why myself and my fellow youth ambassadors, along with the Mental Health Foundation as a whole, really work diligently to create and promote these initiatives to help spread awareness around youth mental health, youth suicide prevention, and assist in helping the youth around Australia know that they aren't dealing with these issues by themselves. So again, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I hope you do enjoy this and find it quite informative and helpful. And to start off with, I'd just like to pass across to Ken Markwell from Australian Unity. Thank you.
Martin, for your welcome. I would now like to introduce the Honourable Ros Spence, MP Minister of Multicultural Affairs, Community, Sport and Youth, who has provided us with a pre-recorded formal address for today. Let me share a little bit of background. Ros Spence is an Australian politician. She has been a part of the Labor Party of the Victorian Legislative Assembly since November 2014, representing the electorate of Euroke. Spence has served as the Minister for Multicultural Affairs, Community, Sport and Youth in the Andrews Ministry since March 2020. I would now like to share the Honourable Ros Spence, MP's Minister's message.
Hello everyone. I wish to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of all Hello everyone. I wish to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of all the lands on which we meet today across the state and pay my respects to elders past, by acknowledging the traditional owners of all the lands on which we meet today across. Hello everyone. I wish to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of all the lands on which we meet today across the state and pay my respects to elders. Hello everyone. I wish to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of all the lands on which we meet today across the state and pay my respects to elders past.
So sorry about that, everyone. Unfortunately, we're having some difficulties on our end, so we won't be able to share her message for today, but we'd like to move on. I would now like to introduce our next speaker, Ken Markwell, Executive General Manager, Indigenous Services at Australian Unity. Ken will provide an address on Australian Unity and youth mental health issues. Ken's people are Munjahali from the Bow Desert region in southeast Queensland. He is also culturally responsible for neighbouring Wangari Burra country. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Ken is passionate about creating and driving positive outcomes for his people. He has been working in Aboriginal affairs for over 20 years, in government, community, corporate and business roles. As a consequence, Ken has developed rich national networks across Australia, including regional and remote areas. For the last 10 years, Ken has focused on economic development and commercial sectors as he has become increasingly convinced the solutions to many of the wicked challenges facing his people is through economic empowerment and independence. This included roles with Ernst & Young and Indigenous Business Australia and running his own successful professional services consulting business, Markwell and Associates. Ken recently commenced with Australian Unity as the Executive General Manager, Indigenous Services, which includes one of the largest home care services for Aboriginal people in Australia, Aboriginal Home Care. The opportunity to be a part of an organisation and team that delivers profound impacts on the lives of elders and vulnerable Aboriginal people is what attracted Ken to the role the most. I would now like to give a warm welcome to Ken Markwell.
Thank you, Tegan, and great to be part of this, and thanks for the invitation. Jingi Wallo, Onyanari, Yambalela, Yugumbe, Yagan, Yoa, Gijum, Johnny Bunbani, Jimbalang. This is my language. It's Yugumbe language, paying respects to elders, past, present, and acknowledging the traditional owners of all the lands and waters we meet today. I would like to offer my condolences to the families of those Australians who have died since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. I also acknowledge the impacts of COVID-19 on other countries close to Australia. The challenges they are facing must be immense. For those who don't know me, my name is Ken Markwell. I'm a Munjahali man. My people are from the Bow Desert region in Queensland. I am the Executive General Manager, Indigenous Services at Australian Unity, which includes Aboriginal Home Care, the largest employer of Aboriginal people in aged care sector in Australia, and the second largest employer of Aboriginal people in New South Wales. I'm also proud that our Indigenous Services leadership team comprises majority Aboriginal people and women. The exec team is 100% Aboriginal, a true Indigenous-led and owned business creating real impacts for vulnerable Aboriginal people. This is key to ensuring a genuine co-design approach to all our programs and activities that have an impact on the lives of First Australians. Within our independent and assisted living platform at Australian Unity, we have Remedy Healthcare team who provide a wide range of allied health services Australia-wide, including corporate health, health coaching, home health care, and specialty aged care health services. Whoever Remedy work with, they have a single aim: to care, coach, empower, and support. We do this using targeted, personalised solutions based on clinically proven techniques. I also want to acknowledge the work of the Mental Health Foundation Australia and their great work in the mental health space. I had the privilege of meeting Minister Ken Wyatt with the Mental Health Foundation Australia last year. It was no surprise to hear him say two of his highest priorities were mental health for frontline workforce and Indigenous youth. Mental Health Month, held in October each year, gives us an opportunity to raise awareness about mental health and wellbeing. It's a chance to promote activities and ideas that can have a positive impact on our daily lives and the lives of others. I've been asked today to speak with you about the impact of our mental health programs on people's lives. For a long time, Australian Unity has recognised the importance of high quality mental health support services and began researching interventions with proven outcomes for our members. After conducting a global search in 2015, we adopted the UK National Health Service model of low intensity behavioural therapy called Improving Access to Psychological Therapies. We then established a partnership with Flinders University to contextualise it to the Australian market and to adapt it for more acute cohort, as we knew the most participants would enter the program having recently been discharged from hospital. Results from Remedy's mental health intervention, MindStep, have shown encouraging results and have been published in the BMC Psychiatry Journal as peer-reviewed evidence. It found that low-intensity cognitive behavioural therapy delivered by Remedy achieved target recovery rates of greater than 50%. Remedy MindStep program evidence of success is important in the Australian healthcare context. Evidence-based interventions are crucial in ensuring public and private health dollars are appropriately utilised and that low value care is not supported. As you are all aware, Australia is one of the most culturally diverse nations in the world. With a significant proportion of Australia's population born overseas, it is crucial we provide services and programs specifically tailored to meet the mental health needs of our culturally and linguistically diverse communities. Organisations such as Mental Health Foundation Australia are working to address shortcomings in research, programs and services for culturally and linguistically diverse Australians. There is more work we need to do to close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians and improve mental health and wellbeing of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. Australian Unity established our Indigenous Services business in 2018, providing culturally appropriate care and improved services with and for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. The Aboriginal Home Care Service provides services to more than 2,500 customers, Aboriginal customers, and in 2019 financial year provided 300,000 hours of care. We're all working and living in a new world with COVID-19. Our team have done an incredible job in keeping so many of our older Australians safe during this pandemic. It's hard to say when things will return to normal, but what I know is that if the way we have responded to this situation is any indication of the future, we're in a good space. I know that people may be feeling uncertain and worried. This is completely understandable, but I know that I'm part of a fantastic team and we're all in this together. So I have a whole team around me, along with people leaders, to help support me, and that's very reassuring. Good mental health is vital for our wellbeing. At Australian Unity, wellbeing is at the heart of everything we do. Back in 2000, Australian Unity conceptualised the idea of a national index of wellbeing that could be used to track social progress in Australia. The index, a joint project of Australian Unity and Deakin University, measures satisfaction with life across a range of areas: standard of living, health, achievement, personal relationships, safety, community connection, and future security. The index investigates additional factors impacting on our lives, filling the void not covered by economic considerations and producing a holistic view of Australians' wellbeing. It also informs public debate about the types of society we want to live in. The Australian Unity Wellbeing Index provides community organisations, government and business decision makers with credible measures of wellbeing for purpose ranging from strategic planning and policy making to providing everyday Australians with information they can use to improve their personal wellbeing. Our rapidly ageing population is an issue of national importance for all Australians. The new normal is that the number of people who are over the age of 65 is growing rapidly. Currently, there are under 3.7 million Australians aged over 65, and this figure is projected to reach almost 5.8 million by 2031. It's true that the aged care sector has been under intense scrutiny for the past 2 years, most notably through the ongoing Royal Commission into Aged Care, Quality and Safety, which has shone a spotlight on the cases where elderly people have been let down by those charged with caring for them. While uncomfortable, this scrutiny is vital if we are to improve standards and stamp out unacceptable practices. However, we should never lose sight of the fact that most of the 366,000 workers in the sector are committed to doing the right thing for the elderly people who rely on their care and support. If anything, this pandemic has only underlined how deep that commitment runs, even if it means they are potentially putting their own lives or their own health at risk. Research released in 2018 that was commissioned by Australian Unity and conducted by PwC showed that if the aged care workforce is to keep up with Australia's ageing population, the sector would need to recruit and train an estimated 180,000 additional workers by 2025. That's a mammoth task, which the research shows will keep growing to 400,000 by 2040. Will only be made harder if, as a society, we don't truly value and support our aged care workers. Older Australians who live in retirement community or an aged care home want to continue their lifelong social activities or take advantage of opportunities to explore new ones. They want to maintain choice and control over what they do and how they socialise with other community residents, their families, friends, and wider community. We understand that aged care and retirement living is very individual, and our homes, retirement communities, amenities, and wellness programs enable our residents to spend their days doing the things they love. In 2012, Australian Unity began implementing a holistic model of care called Better Together to manage and meet the expectations of residents. Aligning our community events or activities with the resident-driven values of Better Together model helps us deliver a successful and well-received social program of events and activities. Our Better Together model of care is a socially driven model of care that highlights the importance of being socially inclusive, of building community and blurring those lines, or divisions, I should say, between residents and staff. This flexible person-centered model of care brings residents, family and staff together in a supportive, relaxed and very human manner. Personal wellbeing appears to increase with age. Some of the most satisfied Australians are aged 65 and over. Their wellbeing is highly influenced by their relationships and interactions with others. This positive connection with others tends to offset their lower satisfaction with health, which declines as age-related ailments set in. The outbreak of COVID-19 will likely have long-term and profound impacts on older Australians' health and wellbeing. Social isolation and loneliness are likely to be the most affected health outcomes and a major risk factor for poor physical and mental health. As we have done to date, we have ensured there is regular communication from Australian Unity with residents, representatives, families and friends. We also strongly encourage connectedness between family and their loved ones during this time by phone or video conference. A key element of our Better Together philosophy is connection. Families and friends are encouraged to stay connected with residents as much as possible to provide support and reassurance. Australian Unity is also demonstrating its ongoing commitment to the health and wellbeing of Aboriginal Australians and communities through its recent investment in the development of Healing Minds. Healing Minds is an initiative that is jointly developed by Australian Unity's Aboriginal Home Care and Remedy Healthcare divisions. The program is modelled on the MindStep program developed by Australian Unity's Remedy Healthcare business unit. MindStep, a trialled and tested program within our Remedy business, having operated for 5 years, it has 9 staff across 3 states nationally. The program provides low-intensity cognitive behavioural therapy. Developed based on the success of the UK National Health Services program as part of their improving access to psychological therapies, utilises confidential phone-based coaching delivered by specially trained mental health coaches using proven techniques with measurable results. The Healing Minds program commenced under the stewardship of Australian Unity's Indigenous Services in July 2020, initially for a test and learn period of 12 months with support of Remedy team and Flinders University. And I'm pleased to say today that we've got more than 20 of our customers from Aboriginal Home Care already commenced the program. It's one of its first of its kind nationally, and I argue internationally, offering culturally safe wellbeing support services delivered to Aboriginal people by Aboriginal coaches. Australian Unity is a company founded on social values and community contribution, and we are committed to building and promoting positive mental health strategies, especially in our aged care homes and retirement communities. I encourage you to be active in connecting with folk who may be lonely and isolated, a relative or a long-lost friend. In closing, Mental Health Month is an important opportunity to raise awareness about the impacts of mental ill health and the range of supports available that can improve someone's sense of well-being. I'm committed to ensuring that we develop and continue to innovate new ways for people to access and receive effective treatments that work to alleviate their mental health symptoms. This is especially true for culturally and linguistically diverse communities, as we know they can be at a higher risk of mental health issues. We have already successfully launched MindStep, a telephone-based, easy-to-access, evidence-based program for people recently admitted to hospital with depression or anxiety symptoms. This fills a gap in the transition back to the community. We will now commit to also work with MHFA to identify service gaps and develop culturally appropriate MindStep services for these communities. This is an important, exciting partnership that can add value to what we do as individual organisations. Thank you so much for listening. Nanyabu.
So much, Ken, for your keynote address, and Australian Unity for your continued support. As a sign of our appreciation, we have sent you a personalised engraved pen. It now gives me great pleasure to announce Professor Richard Newton to provide another keynote address. Professor Richard Newton is the Clinical Director of Peninsula Health Mental Health Service and an Assistant Professor at Monash University. Peninsula Mental Health is a large mental health service based in a teaching hospital. It has a range of adult and aged care mental health services. Richard is also a consultant adult psychiatrist within the organisation. Until 2017, he was also the Medical Director of Austin Mental Health and the Clinical Director of BETRS, a regional eating disorder service. He has a private practice specialising in eating disorders as well. He is also a board member of the Butterfly Foundation and also a board member of the Mental Health Victoria. He has had a number of roles within the Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatrists and is the immediate past chair of the Victorian branch of the college. Richard is a member of the Australian Safety and Quality Commission's Comprehensive Care Advisory Committee and has contributed to the development of the Commission's work on recognition and response to deterioration in mental health. He is strongly committed to quality and safety systems in mental health, consumer and carer participation in mental health service development and the provision of safe, effective, evidence-based interventions for all members within the community. He is the clinical principal investigator at the National Mental Health and Medical Research Council partnership to evaluate the statewide prevention and recovery care in Victoria and has conducted a number of consultancies within the mental health sector. Richard is an editorial board member of national and international academic journals and sits on numerous federal and state-based planning or advisory committees. He has published more than 60 peer-reviewed articles or book chapters. He teaches a master's level course in structured psychotherapy at the University of Melbourne and advanced training course in CBT. I would now like to welcome Professor Richard Newton to speak.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for asking me to talk today. It's wonderful to see how the Mental Health Foundation is developing into a truly national and influential organisation, and it's a privilege to be a part of it. Now, I can see that my slides are up, so let's see if I can make it all work for you. So I'm essentially being asked to talk about youth suicide in the context of this Youth Mental Health Forum. I actually thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit about youth suicide in the context of COVID-19 and trying to help people make sense of some of the slightly contradictory messaging that's coming out at the moment. So if I could go to the next slide. Thank you so much. So when the COVID epidemic started, it was apparent very clearly and quite clearly messaged by people like Pat McGorry, Ian Hickey, Tony Bartoni from the AMA, that young people were going to be particularly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, and especially the measures that were being put in place to stop the spread of the disease. Ian Hickey from the Brain Mind Centre predicted that there would be a 25 to 30% increase in completed suicides in our population as a result of COVID-19, and that this would particularly affect young people who would be most likely to be affected by some of the psychosocial effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, such as unemployment. So if we could go to the next slide, please. But subsequently, some of you would have read in The Age and equivalent papers interstate that there's been no increase in the suicide rate. That in particular, there has been no increase in the suicide rate amongst young people. And The Age, for example, at the end of August, reported from the Victorian coroner that the number of people who had taken their own lives during the first 6 months of this pandemic was broadly the same as the period last year. And that there was no evidence of any increase in suicides amongst young people, and that this finding contradicted the widespread assumptions that the number of suicides under the pressures of COVID-19 lockdowns were not being borne out. And actually, people went on to say things like this: governments, to their enormous credit, state and federal, have come to the party quickly. The hope is that we're getting to people, we're getting the services to people so that they aren't getting to the point of suicide. And if it's possible to move to the next slide again, then you can see that, in fact, there's been an enormous amount of spending by state and federal governments to try and support our community in terms of their mental health during this pandemic. And there have been a large number of new services rolled out. These include extra funding for Headspace to provide outreach services to young people in distress, increased services to school students, particularly year 11 and 12 students, the provision of outreach workers to provide more connection to young people who are isolated, support to Beyond Blue, support to the Butterfly Foundation that I'm a part of, support to additional funding for Lifeline and to the Kids Helpline, as well as the recent increase in the number of Medicare subsidised psychological therapy sessions that was announced in the recent budget. So there has been a lot being done, but that is not why the suicide rate has not increased yet. It may help reduce the suicide rate into the longer term, but it doesn't explain what's going on now. And in fact, what's going on now looks like this. And if you go to the next slide, then what we know is that at the moment, Kids Helpline has had a massive increase in the number of calls to it, 40% more calls than the same time last year. Beyond Blue has seen a similar leap in calls since before the pandemic. The Butterfly Eating Disorders National Helpline has seen a 40% increase in calls from young people with eating disorders. Lifeline is being overwhelmed with calls for help, experiencing its highest level of demand ever. Mental Health Victoria, through its CEO Angus Cleland, is reporting about what's happening within our health services in Victoria. And what I can tell you is that our emergency departments, our triage services of specialist mental health services have seen the same massive disproportionate increase of young people trying to access services who are experiencing marked distress and psychological discomfort. So that's what's actually happening at the moment. And and perhaps because of this, Ian Hickey and the Brain Mind Centre are continuing to message that we should be anticipating and trying to find a way of preventing a marked increase in suicide, but that this will occur after the initial worst effects of the pandemic are over, later on this year, and in particular over next year. And I think the reason for that is what I'd like to talk a little bit more about today, that it's not actually during the immediate stress of a major community crisis that we see changes in suicide rates. Suicide isn't just associated with significant mental illness. For many years, certainly for the last 10 or 15 years, it was thought that mental illness was the main risk factor associated with completed suicide, and that social context and situational risk factors were less important. And I think there is now a shift towards understanding that the social context within our community contributes a massive amount to the completed suicide rate for populations of people. Although people who do die from suicide clearly, of course, have significant psychological distress, hopelessness, despair, and can easily be recognised as having some form of psychological illness. But I'm going to focus a bit more on the social constructs to help us understand why people in our community might kill themselves. And we know, and there's a few examples really of the evidence that is out there that tells us quite clearly that the social bonds and cohesion within our community is vastly important in determining how many people in our community we lose through suicide. And so very simple examples. During the Sydney Olympic Games, the completed suicide rate, the number of people who killed themselves in our country dropped. And at the end of the Olympic Games, where there was a massive amount of national pride, cohesion, joy, shared experience, there wasn't a disproportionate people who would have killed themselves during that Olympic game period didn't kill themselves later. Their lives were saved by the Olympic Games. And even in smaller, if your team is in the footy finals, then people who support that footy team, there will be a reduced completed suicide rate amongst that group of people. So there is something intensely important about social cohesion, shared bonds, and shared goals that protects people from killing themselves. And in the past, of course, that's been seen as highly religious communities have been identified as having lower suicide rates. People who are married tend to have lower suicide rates than people that are not. People who are employed tend to have lower suicide rates than people that are not. People who have close friendships, similarly. And what we know that things that lead to increased rates of community suicide is if there's easy means, if there's societal discrimination against help seeking for mental illness, if there's high rates of unemployment, a lot of financial insecurity, high, easy access to alcohol and drugs. We know that people from the LGBTIQ+ community have extremely high rates of completed suicide compared to the rest of the community. We think that's both a combination of stigma, stress, but also how difficult it is often for people from the LGBTIQ plus community to be able to seek and access help in a way that isn't stressful and traumatizing in itself. So there's lots of work we can do there. I was going to talk about the importance of politics in understanding this. And again, just to demonstrate the importance of social factors. When the USSR broke up and communism collapsed, you would have expected and predicted that that would have been an extremely stressful time in Russia, and that there would have been a significant increase in suicide rates as all of that social cohesion and economic stress took part. But actually, one of the things that happened was, and those of you that are my age would remember this, Boris Yeltsin put up a tax on vodka, and I think he increased the tax on vodka by about 10 times. And just reducing the amount of alcohol that was being drunk in the community at that time meant that during the breakup of the USSR, simply because of that increasing cost of alcohol and reduced availability, the suicide rate absolutely dropped at a time when you would have expected it to increase. And I've put here as well something about suicide legislation. Now, I'm not suggesting that anything about that in any way that we should have legislation against suicide, not at all. But I want to use this as an example of things that we can do as a community, that there are things that we can do as a community that change the likelihood that people will die. And this is an example from 2000 years ago when the Roman Empire, which actually saw suicide as an honourable thing to do, they actually developed a problem. They had an epidemic of youth suicide, and the context for that was this was in young soldiers who were being sent up to Hadrian's Wall in Scotland, which is where I did my training, just outside there, and the prospect of being transferred and made to serve out their service in this cold, isolated, primitive place led to many more of them killing themselves than in committing suicide. And so the Roman Senate made suicide illegal in order to prevent soldiers killing themselves instead of going up to Hadrian's Wall. And that had an immediate effect on reducing suicide rates. Of course, subsequently, legislation against suicide has contributed massively to stigma and discrimination in a negative way around the issues of mental illness. And so it is, I would just be clear, is not something I would advocate. But it's a really interesting example of what of the power that politicians and the community can exert. And I think for me, one of our challenges is going to be to find out in the political sphere to help young people survive this pandemic without this massive increase in suicide rates. So could we go to the next slide, which is slide 10 on my list, understanding the time course. So I'm hoping that you can see this. If you can't, then this is what I wanted to talk about was what we understand as being the stressors, how stressors such as COVID affect a community. And essentially what we know is that during the period of time when the crisis is upon a community, then that community tends to respond, and it's called in a heroic honeymoon way. They cohere, they come together and work together in a bonded, socially connected way that actually helps that community survive, work well, and emotionally survive. If the crisis continues, then over the next 1 to 2 years, there will be a prolonged period of disillusionment where people who are not feeling connected and bonded to the community, or where the community feels disillusioned with the responses of health services, the politicians, etc., become depressed, stressed, and it is at that time, the year after the crisis, where typically community suicide rates are going to increase. And that's why I think it's helpful to understand that at the moment, we're not seeing the enormous stress that young people are feeling translating into completed suicide rates. And so we need, if we're going to prevent an increase in suicide amongst young people over the next 2 years, we need to ensure that all people who are feeling distressed, finding it hard to manage in this isolated, financially stressed, scary time, that they can access good quality mental health care and support. And so access to good services is absolutely vital. But what is also vital is a community response that understands that it is going to be the next 1 to 2 years that are important in providing people not just with health support, but also financial security, employment, safe, affordable housing, good access to positive educational experiences, a fair and tolerant community, as well as access to good support. And so it's not, if we are going to support young people during this time, if indeed we're going to support everybody in this time, in terms of their mental health, it cannot just be a health service response that we need to advocate for. It has to be a whole of community response in which we hold our governments to account for ensuring good financial security, employment, housing, etc. So I can see that I'm out of time, so I will stop there. Thank you. And I'll answer any questions that people have got.
Professor Richard Newton for your detailed presentation, and as we mentioned before, we will be sending you an engraved pen on behalf of the Mental Health Foundation to thank you for your address. The slides will be also sent to everyone's email after this presentation. Sorry that we had some difficulties with that. I would now like to introduce Professor David Castle to provide an address on suicide, what each of us can do and how to prevent it. David is currently the Chair of Psychiatry at St Vincent's Health and the University of Melbourne. He is a former MRC Research Scholar at the South African Institute for Medical Research, MRC Research Fellow at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where he gained MSc in Epidemiology. As he has trained both in clinical research and psychiatry at London's respected Maudsley Hospital and Institute of Psychiatry. David's clinical and research interests include schizophrenia and related disorders, cannabis abuse and bipolar disorder. He has a long-standing interest in the impact of licit and illicit substances on the brain and body, and is entirely engaged in programs addressing the physical health of the mentally ill and the mental health of the physically ill. He is also pursuing his work on OCD spectrum disorder, particularly body dysmorphic disorder, in which he is recognised as an international expert. I would now like to invite Professor David Castle to share his insights.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate being invited. I have a slight complaint, Tegan, that Richard Newton's introduction was much longer than mine. And he actually said a lot of the things which I wanted to say. But in many ways that makes my job easier. I'm really honoured to be part of the Mental Health Foundation, and I'm on the board, and I'd like to expressly commend the Youth Ambassador Program and all the young people who have given up their time to be engaged in the Mental Health Foundation. Mental Health Month, as it now is upon us. As we've heard, it's a time of extreme stress for many people within society, and as Richard Newton has very nicely articulated, the risks associated with mental health are not to be downplayed. However, I think that we should also maintain hope and positivity here, because we sometimes can underestimate the resilience of people, including young people. I'm continually impressed by patients of mine who, many of whom might have had long-standing, very difficult psychiatric disorders, but who have marshaled themselves and their supports during this very difficult time of COVID-19, and have really rallied and shown adaptability and extraordinary bravery within the face of this pandemic. But it's tough. It's really tough for society in general, and I'm particularly concerned, of course, about young people. I'm also very concerned about older people, actually, because many older people are very isolated, and even more isolated under the lockdown rules. And isolation is one of the things which we really don't want if we are looking at trying to help and support people and help them with their mood, help them with their resilience and reduce suicide rates. Young people are particularly up against it because this is coming at a time when many of them are struggling with a whole lot of other issues, including developmental issues and also vocational issues. I have a number of patients who, in fact, one I spoke to this morning in year 12, and I think that they're particularly struggling at the moment. And one of my year 12 patients actually shared with me that one of her, somebody in their school had taken their life tragically very recently. So these are real time, these are incredibly sad events which are occurring for our young people, and we need to offer as best support we can. In terms of the challenges of suicide, I have a series of quotes from a very nice and sensible review of the state of the art with regard to suicide prevention from a decade ago. I don't think all that much has changed. This is from a colleague called Dr. Kane from the US. He says, generally, there's an inability to discriminate the relatively few true cases, that is, people who actually end up killing themselves, from the large number of what he calls false positives. That's a rather sort of brutal epidemiological term, but the point he's making really is that the ability to predict accurately suicide and suicidality is actually very difficult, and it's something which certainly my field has struggled with for a very long time. Kane also says the number of true positives that escape prevention it continues. So what that means is that many lethally intent individuals are simply not identified and are missed. And that is, again, an indictment of our inabilities in terms of accurate prediction. He also says that the inability of clinical and social services to reach many individuals who have suicidal intent is an ongoing concern. And I would suggest that this is still the case in our 10 years later, i.e. 2020. And of course, this is fomented by the fact that there's dislocation of services because of inabilities for face-to-face meetings and so forth. Happily, we have very good technology in Australia, and our governments have opened up use of telepsychiatry and so forth, which is very helpful. As Richard Newton says, the use of helplines has increased. I see that this is a good thing. I think that people are showing that they understand how to access these things and are finding them helpful. And again, I would encourage people who are having issues and concerns to use those opportunities and also to access their general practitioners. But it's fair to say that we only know about those people who actually are accessing it by the very nature of it. So there are clearly people who are in distress and who are not accessing these services, and we need to advocate to them to reach out to services. So that's an ongoing issue for us. Kane goes on to talk about a continuing paucity of knowledge about fundamental biological, psychological, social and cultural factors that contribute to suicide risk amongst diverse populations and groups. So what he's really saying is that there's limited understanding of how to define and the various risk factors and how they come together, how individual risk factors interact with societal risk factors, for example. And that's a gap, which is a very important gap, because if you're really going to marshal and mobilize supports and structures to be able to protect people, then you need to understand the conurbation of different risks and how those come at a societal level, and then how they draw down at an individual level. And finally, Kane says the lack of coordinated strategies for suicide prevention that can deal efficiently with myriad local, regional, state, national agencies and organizations that could in theory play a role in prevention of suicide is again an ongoing issue. I keep on saying to people, rather than seeing COVID-19 through a tarnished lens where everything looks bleak and grey and the future is clouded, see the opportunities which it brings. And one of the opportunities maybe this can bring is for us to get better coordination of services and better articulation of the interaction between different services. We live in a very complex system structure here with regard to mental health service delivery. And we need to get a whole lot better at it. It's hugely fragmented, it's hugely difficult to negotiate, and maybe there's an opportunity now with COVID-19 being a bit of a catalyst for us to get these things better and get articulation and communication better. Kane's final plea is that we must all try and work together to reduce the prevalence of adversities that drive human vulnerabilities towards distress and disease. At the same time, increases people's willingness to grab a helping hand. Perhaps then we will see a steady decline of suicide. So what he's saying is it's complex, it's multifaceted, it's multi-layered, and there's work to be done at every single level. Brought into stark contrast by COVID-19, as I said, and what Richard has shared with us. I'll remind us sociologically about suicide and the social issues, because this is one of the main areas which we are needing to understand better and also use in terms of trying to reduce suicide rates. And I go back to the French academic Durkheim, who talked about social origins of these suicide really. And one of the frames he has was anomie. So this notion of anonymity within society and a lack of feeling of belonging within society. And he also, put that up as a potential for us to actually look at addressing to try and get better cohesion within societies. Ironically, the times over the last 100 years which have seen the lowest rates of suicide was the Second Great War, so the Second World War. Partly that's because people felt very bonded in a way against a tyranny of Nazi Germany. And Australia saw a reduction in suicide rates in those times. Of course, it saw an increase in suicides, as did many countries in the lead up to the Second World War, i.e. in the Great Depression and the aftermath of the Great Depression. And that was associated with all sorts of economic problems, as you know, and loss of role and so forth. So again, learning from these things, what it says is trying to marshal identity as a society and societal values is going to be important in our addressing these things. And, you know, we do look to government to do this to some degree, but of course we as individuals need to live as best we can live and make sure that we are doing the right thing by the law and by what we need to do under COVID restrictions to protect ourselves, our families, and everybody else. But we also need to ensure that in socially distancing, we are not socially isolating. Aristotle said, man is a social animal. And what he was getting at, partly at least, was that our importance of social connection is paramount. Without social connection, we are bereft. So do not read social distancing as social dislocation. Read social distancing as what it is, the physical distancing, what we need to adhere to under COVID-19, but build social connections and build them better. There are plenty of things to be able to allow us to do this. The technology which we're using today, not faultless, but mostly works pretty well actually. And you can have a visual, even if you can't have a visual, at least you can have an auditory connection with fellow human beings. And there's lots of iterations on this technology which allow you to catch up with people. I've been using this opportunity again, seeing COVID not through this tarnished lens, but through an opportunistic lens that allows connection with people who I haven't had connection with for decades. You know, people who I went to school with back in South Africa years ago, and I can still connect with them now, and that's been actually a beautiful thing to do. Spending more time with family, feeling more connected with family. I know it's stressful, especially if you have small accommodation and you've got lots of people within that accommodation, that's stressful, but there's also ways of making it easier and better for yourself, including sharing household tasks, engaging in programs which you might enjoy together. I think all of these things are really important. And reaching out to individuals in distress. And a lot of young people in particular, as Richard Newton has been saying, are under significant distress. So being aware of the signs that somebody might be becoming distressed and potentially at risk of suicide. Being aware of the risks of individuals retreating into themselves, becoming depressed, becoming isolated. Being aware when people start to use much more alcohol than they used to. One of the biggest associations of completed suicide is alcohol and other drugs. So monitoring that in ourselves, monitoring that in people who are our loved ones around us. Being aware that people who are more likely to complete suicide are people who might have attempted suicide before, or people who have a particular family history or a personal history of depression in particular. Other risk groups include people with chronic pain syndromes, for example, chronic physical problems, and then the problems associated with socioeconomic downturns. And those include financial and employment. In fact, there was a very interesting piece of work which was done in the UK when I was training there in the early 90s, and then Prime Minister John Major had a whole lot of targets, and the one target for health was a reduction in suicide rates by 15%, 1.5% that was. And people looked at the psychiatric profession to deliver on this. Well, colleagues of mine pointed out, actually, the biggest bang for your buck you get with prevention of suicide is actually at a socioeconomic level. Increasing employment, probably the best thing, single thing you can do. Because, and now we're going to see, unfortunately, an increase in unemployment rates. But that does not mean need to lose hope, lose faith, lose confidence about themselves. There's opportunities within COVID restrictions, for example, to upskill yourself to, there's lots of free courses online or paid courses which can upskill you and enhance your opportunities with regard to the workplace. And it's a way of again, seeing this as somewhat opportunistic, but we need to be realistic about it. The time coming up, as Richard Newton said a number of times, is going to be a risky time, and we mustn't lose vigilance around risk and individuals at risk in the time coming up. We know that suicide can be diverted, and we know that most people who complete suicide have had contact with a health professional in the lead up, and we know that they are mostly showing signs of depression. We need to be aware of those signs, as I've alluded to already, and other risk factors such as substance use, alcohol use, and so forth, and divert those individuals to seek help. There's helplines, and they are pleasingly seeing, and I say pleasingly because I think it's an indication that people are accessing them and finding them helpful. And then, of course, there's support from local general practitioners, there's support from psychiatrists, there's access to psychologists and so forth through better access schemes. All of these are available to us in Australia, and we need to make use of them. We also, through Mental Health Foundation, provide support groups. I advocate for those. We need to really reach out to each other and support each other and show the value which we place in each other as social beings, and then identify high-risk individuals and make sure that they get appropriate psychiatric or psychological care. I really wanted to just end by thanking you all very much for your participation, and I see we have over 100 participants, which is terrific. I want to thank Mental Health Foundation and the staff for setting this up. I'd also like to thank Richard Newton for his excellent address and for having raised so many crucially important points and made my job very much easier in terms of just pulling some of those things together. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor David Castle, for your address. Sorry. We also have an engraved pen for yourself as well that we will send out on behalf of the Mental Health Foundation. I would now like to introduce Tion van der Merwe, who will be providing an address on from her youth perspective, as well as her experience with this issue. Tion recently graduated from Deakin University with a Bachelor of Environmental Science Marine Biology and was set to pursue a career in marine science and conservation. In 2019, however, she lost her partner to suicide and has been since actively involved in mental health advocacy, suicide awareness and community outreach, and as well as community outreach work. Since the start of the year, she has been volunteering with AMS Australia as a settlement volunteer, supporting refugee and migrant families to adapt to a new life in Australia during the strange COVID-19 world. She is also a member of the Youth Advisory Committee for the Mental Health Foundation Australia's 2020 Youth Ambassadors Program. Though still a strong conservationist, Tion is pursuing ways to combine her two passions by utilising the healing power of nature to support those struggling with mental health issues, trauma and grief. Now welcoming Tion van der Merwe.
Great, thank you Tegan for that lovely introduction. I hope everyone can hear and see me. Hello everyone, it's so great to be here with you today. As Tegan said, my name is TNA and I've been a part of Mental Health Foundation Australia's Youth Ambassador Program this year. Before I do get started, I'd like to also just acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today. For me here in Geelong, that is the people of the Wathaurong Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge that the topic of mental health and suicide is especially relevant to Indigenous communities right across Australia. So I thank all those Indigenous Australians with us in the audience today for being here in what has been, I'm sure, a triggering year in the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement right across the world. I'm very honoured to be here today to share with you a bit of my experience with suicide and introduce to you a snippet of my partner Rob's story. Rob died by suicide in July 2019 after surviving with anxiety and depression for well over a decade. I can in no way shed light on what that fight must have been like for him, nor is my experience a representation of anyone else's story, as I know that these are so unique to every individual and every circumstance. But what I can do is share a bit of my own insight into the lessons that I've learned from seeing the way in which Rob fought his own war in life and in the strength that I've been able to find in myself in the wake of his death. When first considering where I would start in telling my story today, I kept finding it really difficult to stop myself from wanting to share his entire life story, which would take days to go over. And I started wondering why I always felt it to be so important to talk to people about Rob's life and what he was like in life before explaining to people the way that he died. And I think this is because I knew that if I just told people that Rob suicided, that a whole lot of presumptions would be made about him without them ever really knowing him. And that includes things like him being selfish, weak, or taking the easy way out. To me, those qualities just don't fit in Rob's story at all. To me, Rob was the most courageous, strong and resilient fighter. He was brave enough to actively seek out help and openly talk about his struggles. He had overcome his own trauma after his dad's suicide when he was 13, and he actively campaigned for spreading suicide awareness across his community, knowing very well the long-lasting effects on those left behind. Grief after losing a loved one is a lot easier to see physically on a person and to understand than a mental illness. And I think that this is why it's easy for a lot of people to think of suicide as a selfish act, because they can just see that grief that's left behind. But there is nothing selfish about battling a cancer of the soul. There's nothing selfish about being worn down and beaten by a debilitating illness of the mind. I firmly believe that in Rob's last few days, he was thinking mostly of his family and his closest friends, of those people that he believed he was burdening with his pain and his suffering. And there is no doubt in my mind that he knew how much he was loved and that he knew he would be terribly missed. But I really also think that he truly thought he was offering those loved ones a sense of relief and peace by disappearing from their life and taking away that extra burden that they had from his pain and suffering. I know in his mind at that time that he was acting out of love and compassion for us. And that to me is an act of complete selflessness. For me, it is important to remember that so that I can make sure that I let him have that I live my best life for him and let myself feel that release and feel that peace that I know he is no longer suffering and I no longer have to worry about him. That leads me onto what for me has been one of the greatest gifts to have come from my own grief and trauma. A suicide, more than most other deaths, I think, leave you with many unanswered questions and a whole mixed pot of intense emotions that lead you to being extremely confused and struggling to make sense and meaning of the world. The immediate months following Rob's death, I was in a desperate search for answers. I wanted to seek out professional help just so that I could fit all the puzzle pieces together and figure out what had happened and why this had happened, deal with that emotion, and then get back to a state of normal, of the way that things were for me before Rob died. It took me quite a long time to really realize that things were never going back to the way they were before, that my life had been completely changed forever. When I did first realize this, it absolutely terrified me. It took me a lot of professional counselling and a lot of personal growth, and is still a work in progress. But it took that time for me to come to terms with the fact and to embrace that this change in my life, though arising from a horrible event, doesn't need to be a bad change. We've all heard a lot about post-traumatic stress disorder, and for anyone who has lost someone to suicide or has experienced an attempt, you're likely to always have triggers and symptoms of post-traumatic stress. But there is also something called post-traumatic growth. Death by suicide has taught me so much about the way that I want to continue to live my life and that I want to be here. It has given me a new perspective on experiencing adversity. It has shown me my own strength and courage and triggered a warrior in me that I never knew existed before. It has given me an ability to connect with family and friends and even complete strangers on such a higher emotionally intelligent level than I've ever been able to before, and opened up a way for me to understand and feel compassion for people with opposing beliefs and worldviews. It has opened up extremely vulnerable conversations between people I have only before known on fairly surface level, and has given me an opportunity to truly make an impact in other people's lives. It sounds very strange to say it in this way, but I feel as though if I could give someone the experience of learning and growing through grief, the feeling of gratitude and love, and the ignition of a strength and resilience in oneself that all comes from losing someone to suicide, if I could give someone all of those things without also giving them the pain and suffering that goes with it, then grief would be the greatest gift I could give anyone. Through post-traumatic growth, we can truly overcome and succeed, not just in spite of, but precisely because of. We can give our trauma power and provide victims of suicide, our loved ones, with that very meaning and purpose that they were struggling so hard to find. The last idea that I'd like to touch on and really leave you with today is that of talking. And by talking, I'm referring to it in a number of different ways. Firstly, as I touched on before, and anyone that has lost a loved one to suicide would know, it leaves you with a world of unanswered questions and with an urge to find someone or something to blame, someone or something to take responsibility and to explain it to you. This is something that may never go away, and so far for me, it hasn't. But one thing that has really been incredibly helpful to me is talking, and talking to Rob about it. For me, that has taken form in writing letters to him, telling him about my days, about what I'm struggling to work out, about what I have learned about him in this time, what I'm grateful for, and what I'm angry about. Apologising to him for my mistakes and airing out my guilt and my shame. And one of the most helpful tools I've found is not just writing to him, but also writing back. This, for me, has helped me to make sense of some of all that happened and provided me with a way to learn to forgive myself. Because I know that if Rob could write a letter to me, that's one of the first things that he would say. Not everyone would find solace in letters, but finding a way that works for you to connect with and talk to and carry your loved one with you, I think is a really important first step in healing. Death ends a life, but it doesn't have to end a relationship. Secondly, talking to people around you about your loved one's suicide. Sharing stories and memories of Rob's life with his family and friends has been the greatest way for me to feel understood and supported and like I'm not going through it alone. It has helped me carried the good times with me and ensured that we all remember that suicide is just the way that Rob died, but it does not define him. His life was so much more than his illness, and the impact that he made on those close to him will forever live on in the tiny changes that we now make on other people's lives because of him. Lastly, for those of you here today who may have had thoughts of ending your own life, those survivors with us who have attempted and are still here fighting, and those who are thinking, yeah, I know someone who I think might be in this spot right now. To all of you, I say talking about suicide is the best thing you can do for yourself and your loved one. Most people who do attempt suicide the first time will fail. However, those that do survive are much more likely to succeed in their second attempt. So talking about suicide to someone who is contemplating, and more importantly, listening to understand without judgment and without blame, dramatically reduces the likelihood of that person taking action. It can provide people with a space to unburden themselves of this secret and this shame that they can carry inside. And it can give them a view to consider so many other options that maybe in the mental space that they're in, they have been blinded to before. Talking about suicide is a way to understand, to heal, to connect, and to prevent. Suicide is preventable. Thank you very much for having me here today, for providing me with this platform to share my experience, and for ultimately giving meaning and purpose to Rob's life through sharing this story. Thank you. I'll pass back to you, Tegan.
Thank you so much, Tion, for sharing your personal story. And I'd just like to say I'm so sorry to hear of your loss. I think your address was beautifully in Rob's honour. And as someone who has lost someone to suicide just a few years ago, I can completely relate to some of the things you've said. And I just wanted to mention that to everyone, although I'm the MC, I've also been through it myself. And I think Tion's message was so real and so true, that the ultimate thing we need to do is to talk about this. To talk about suicide, to name it, to say it out loud and raise awareness, because it is a very real thing. And just like you said, we can change the outcome that people may feel is the only outcome. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for your personal story. That meant a lot to all of us here. So this concludes our presentation today on youth suicide and mental health. I speak on behalf of the whole team at the Mental Health Foundation Australia in extending our many thanks and gratitude for all speakers involved today. To our special guest speakers, Martin, Ken, the Honourable Ros Spence, although we couldn't see her message, Richard, David and Tion, we thank you so much. And as mentioned, we will be sending you all a personalised engraved pen on behalf of the Foundation's appreciation. To our sponsors, Australian Unity, Vic Health and the Department of Health and Human Services, we thank you tremendously. We would like to finish off by reminding all attendees with a take-home message. If someone you know is suffering with mental health problems, you can support them by being supportive and empathetic, being open and understanding without judgment, simply listening rather than sharing personal opinions or advice, encouraging contact with family and friends, asking the person how you can help them or how someone else might be able to help them. And if you have the information, then you can provide them with these resources. Otherwise, you can always help them find those resources. Avoid sharing your own concerns if the situation is not mutual and they just feel like they need someone to listen. Consider reasonable modifications to reduce work or study related stress and compensate for any disability. Implementing school, workplace, anti-bullying, anti-discrimination policies, and always ensuring safety. If thoughts of suicide are communicated, facilitate contact with student health services, GP or crisis services. Follow the guidelines within the school, university or college about mental health policies. Most importantly though, please remember you are not the therapist, but you can be one of the best person to support. The most important thing is creating open conversations, especially during the situation that we're in of COVID-19. Finally, just once again, if anything that was addressed throughout this event was confronting for you, please know that there is always help. As mentioned at the beginning, you can contact the Mental Health Helpline Service on 1300 MHF AUS, otherwise 1300 643 287. Otherwise, you can always contact Lifeline on 13 11 14. Thank you again for everyone for joining us today. We hope you've enjoyed as much as we have been able to provide you with this forum. Thank you so much.